Welcome everyone at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. My name is Anne-Sophie Crépin. I'm the Deputy Director of the Bayer Institute, and I'm very happy to present Klaus Eisenack, who is going to hold the Stockholm Seminar. And the Stockholm Seminar is co-organized by the Bayer Institute, the Stockholm Resilience Center, the Global Economic Dynamics and the Biosphere Program, the Anthropocene Laboratory. I have the list here because there is Alba Eco and Future Earth, I think, and the Stockholm Resilience Center, of course. So that's the whole list. I'm very happy to have Klaus here, and I was thrilled when you asked me in the fall, oh, I'm going to do a sabbatical. Could I come to Stockholm? Yes, I said, come to us. That's great. So I'm happy that you are here and that you will give a seminar to us today. And Klaus Eisenack is Professor of Resource Economics at Humboldt University in Berlin. Before that, he was at the University of Oldenburg, and he has also been active at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. He holds a PhD in mathematics from the Free University of Berlin, and he has also background in mathematics, economics, and philosophy. So it's an interesting mix. Klaus, the floor is yours.
So, now I'm here. Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for the kind introduction. And anyway, thanks for the great invitation here to Stockholm, which I enjoy a lot. And I'm still here for a moment, for some weeks. My talk today could be read as a kind of footnote on the think globally, act locally mantra, if you want to say. So I will talk about urban areas or municipalities or local governments. So there are slight differences in the terminology, but I will try to get you more broader overview and try to avoid jargon. I don't know whether I'm able to do that. So this can be read against also background, some basic facts we are, I guess, mostly aware of. So now more than 50% of the world population lives in urban areas. However you define that, depending how you estimate, about 3/4 of greenhouse gas emissions are caused in cities or urban areas. And cities are also affected by climate change, maybe more than other areas. So for example, a large share of the urban population lives in low-lying coastal areas, so their sea level rise is of course an issue. But generally, of course, cities are characterized by dense infrastructures, a concentration of social and economic functions on small space. We have urban heat island effects, so there are some factors where we can say that cities maybe are more vulnerable. So we have good reasons to ask, what is it about cities and climate change? Actually, there's an IPCC special report planned for this coming out in maybe in 2 or 3 years. So having said that, does it really matter to consider municipal climate action? And there might be some objections to that, although of course cities are important, but we can say, hey, what can city governments do? Maybe they have too limited action space for that. It might be, okay, cities or urban areas are doing something, but actually it's the nation states that matters and just cities or local governments following suit. So maybe it's not the central actor here. So that it might be that local governments might only do something if they are obliged to, maybe by national laws or as a kind of schemes. So this is a kind of objection. And the other one, and that goes a little bit more analytically, if you take it as a free rider problem. So globally, addressing climate change is a free rider problem. Some countries are doing maybe more of the job, so others can get it for free. So that is difficult for already, we know the difficulties, right? Globally, that's already difficult was the United Nations member states. But if cities should do that, hey, we have hundreds of thousands of cities on the world. So that's even more difficult to get around these problems. So why should we expect that? And if we take this free rider objection seriously and observe that cities might say, hey, we are doing something, maybe this is just lip service. Maybe they just pretend because they have no good reason to do that. So with my talk today, I want to address these objections and qualify and confirm or reject them. And I want to enrich this with a summary, a very short summary of some recent findings of what is actually driving what is going on with municipal climate action, to bring this into resonance. So let's go to cities have action space or not. So here we have a breakdown of emissions from the last IPCC report, where we see at least a certain important share of greenhouse gas emissions is related to buildings and the transport sector, which are very much or to considerable part addressed actually by urban areas. We can still say, okay, maybe these emissions are caused there, but can really local governments make a difference here? There have been different attempts to estimate or to determine what cities can do, what action space or autonomy they have. So the most important work, it's even developed an index and compared across different countries and years over the world. Of course, there are huge differences. Cities in China or in the United Kingdom have much less action space than cities in the United States or in Germany, for instance. And we have various dimensions, but what many cities in the world, not everywhere, tend to have is action space on land use policies, to some degree on transport and on housing, and also on waste management. So even in very authoritarian countries, frequently local governments can decide on how to treat waste management. So cities don't always have action space, but they have to a considerable degree, depending on which context you look at. So they can do something. Do they do something? And this is a world map of cities who have pledged to reduce carbon dioxide emissions to zero, with different reference years, so that is not mapped here directly. And so this is a long list, right? This is already 5 years old, this map, yeah? So something is going on here in terms of what climate scholars call mitigation. So that's a term I will use frequently right here. These net zero pledges are promises to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this can be considered as mitigation when you reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's also interesting that it's not only a thing going on the ground. If you read the Paris Agreement, that's in the part of the preamble, they explicitly acknowledge that it's not only a job of nation states, they also want other actors to take part of that. Actually, now there's a stream in the United Nations Conference of Parties for the climate framework directive where cities can officially, or city representatives can officially speak to national governments. So they're not just only observers anymore. They have that was 2 years ago for the first time that there was an official role for cities here as well. So this is about mitigation, about dealing with the climate change problem by its root. They are also active in terms of adaptation. So this is here just a map for Europe. Just to clarify, adaptation is the other broad approach to deal with climate change. So it's more difficult to define, but these are actually ways to deal with the problems once climate change is happening. You can think about improved flood protection against sea level rise or heavy rain, having reliable water provision in droughts, and so on and so forth. And now more and more cities in the world also have at least plans where they consider how should we adapt to climate change. Here you see this in a recent study for Europe, where the color tells you how old these plans are. So some countries started quite early with having adaptation plans. Some did later. And this is a study where they assess the plan's quality. So of course a plan can be blah, blah. Anyway, it's only text, right? But you can try to assess whether it's a more consistent text or maybe just a cut and paste of other texts. And so you see some variations, but you see a lot of adaptation that is going on. The further interesting thing, I think, where cities are becoming active are city networks. This is a membership map from the largest city network we currently have. This is the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. So this screenshot is from 23 this morning. It was already more than 13,000 cities which are member of this network. But this is just one, so there are more elite networks like the C40 climate leadership groups. That's a very old one that is not only on climate, but on sustainability in general. Climate Mayors, for instance, is a network about 300 cities from the United States. I just looked up on their website last week, so they even had a first announcement where, although they claim to be bipartisan, they say we need to save the EPA to have to sustain safe and healthy and unpolluted cities. So they are also not only networking, they are also engaging in advocacy. They're engaging in mostly, I would say, an exchange of experience, what to do about adaptation and mitigation. Okay, but these are plans and networks, right? You might network and it's nice to meet people from other cities, but does it make a difference on the ground? That it's still difficult to assess, but we have first assessments regarding emissions of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is again an analysis for Europe, spatially resolved. Blue means they have a decrease in emissions in this area. Red, they increased over the reference period. And in the study by Angel Sue and colleagues, they also compared averages for countries against the emission reductions for the whole country and their targets. So they can say that at least in some regions, cities achieve more emission reduction than is aimed for by the national targets. So there's something going on here. But indeed, we know emissions are reduced, but not all everywhere. So this is why I put the indeed question here. Is it really happening and where is it really happening? And scientifically and also in terms of our policy relevance, of course, it's important to know under which conditions actually, right, these emissions are reduced, whether it's more than just pretending. So, and for this question, under which conditions, there's now a huge literature that tries to find out what is actually driving success here. And I will give you some snapshots here of this literature. So let's go again to this idea. It might be the nation states that actually matter. And maybe cities are just following suit. So we might ask the question, are municipalities more ambitious than the countries they are in, or maybe they are less ambitious or just the same? The null hypothesis would be it's just the same, right? Here I need to have a word of caution since I'm summarizing such a broad literature now. And when I speak about ambition, it can mean quite different things depending on the concrete study. They measure this by quite different ways. You can consider, as 2 slides ago, ambition being actually whether you have a climate plan or a high quality climate plan or a very ambitious target to reduce emissions a lot. It might be that you set up financial schemes, but it might also mean that you are really engaging in investments, for example, to be more robust to climate impacts. And ultimately, ambition can be achieved, emission reductions compared to that you have promised to achieve. And it's interesting that some studies show that indeed there are instances of high local ambition, even if national ambitions are quite weak or even absent. So there might be climate plans or activities that are maybe driven by other local priorities. Some cities formulate their own activities directly as a response to a lack of national action. So it's not enough is happening nationally. So we need to step up to substitute that. And some studies also show that those cities that want to step up against missing national action sometimes then look for those city networks to have a kind of for compensation for a missing national level policy. They try to network with cities from other countries. Of course, it would raise the question now, what is currently happening in the United States with cities? I can't tell you yet whether they step up here again. While actually in you see, this is more or less an older literature, and the more studies that were published in the last 5 years, I would say lean more to the other level that actually local climate policies are somehow aligned with national or regional or maybe European climate policy. So this can be through environmental regulations where cities are forced to deal with the carbon price, or explicit mandates that they need to do something by national laws. There can be financial incentives or support schemes, or just technical guidance how to do it in a better way that comes, for example, by the European Union. So now I see a hand up. Should we have? Yeah? Yeah, I don't know what the practice is. I go after. Okay. Right, so but I'm happy, of course, about those questions then. Okay, so these are cases where this goes together. And we also see a further pattern here. There are sometimes countries that, for example, oblige their cities to do climate action, but the cities don't do so. In the United Kingdom, for example, that at least for the data we had in this study here, that was for 2017, they were really lagging behind what they were supposed to do. I don't know how it's at the moment. So overall, we can see it's a mixed picture. We can reject that it's only cities simply following nations. It's not that simple. But yeah, it depends maybe on the context, whether it's this way or the other way around. So if some cities act without a national obligation, voluntarily to some degree, then it's a question, why could this be then? What are good reasons for cities to do that? And there's a long list, and I want to just shed light on two possible views on that. So one is vulnerability. So vulnerability can be it's also a vague term. It can be, in the IPCC, it's defined as a sensitivity or the susceptibility to harm from climate change. So how strongly you should be affected or could be affected by climate impacts. And of course, you might say it's plausible if a city is more affected or expected to be more affected by climate change, then it might have good reasons to do something to deal with that. We indeed find that in some studies that cities which are more vulnerable, which can measure it in different ways, are more likely to have adaptation plans or having more ambitious adaptation plans. So this somehow confirms our gut feeling, in particular in terms of adaptation. Adaptation is an attempt to protect yourself. So why should you not protect yourself against a problem, right? You can take more objective vulnerability indicators to show that. So young et al., I think they use the share of very young and very old population because they have more problems with heat waves. Yeah. And then they can show they're better in terms of adaptation. Many other studies find more, it's not the objective vulnerability, but more of the subjective or perceived vulnerability that matters more. But there are also studies that show that vulnerability has actually no effect. So you can compare maybe coastal cities, which might be susceptible to sea level rise, with inland cities in very safe environments, and some studies do not find a significant difference here. And also case studies are mixed here. And when you go for mitigation, so greenhouse gas emission reductions, it's really hard to find studies that show that vulnerability motivates climate action, which is more plausible since with mitigation we have the global free rider problem, so a single city can only make a very small difference. So, okay, little bit intuition, but hey, maybe vulnerability is not the only thing in town here. That's good reason to think about further reason. And another that is frequently discussed are climate policy co-benefits. So co-benefits can stem you're doing some policy in a certain field, and as a byproduct, you can do more easy climate policies or the other way around. So you might deal with local air pollution. Then you have a good reason maybe to improve your traffic system to have better air quality. That is what Paris has done, in particular before the Olympics. And then you improve your transport system, and then in bypassing, you also reduce other emissions, say carbon dioxide emissions from cars. And then you can say, okay, we also did some climate policy here. And there are some studies, it's a Norwegian study, that find that co-benefits, when you can measure them in those various ways, that they can explain part of being more ambitious both in adaptation and mitigation terms. Other studies show that it's maybe not the objective co-benefits, but it's more that co-benefits are used as an argument in the documents to legitimize action. So in this paper with Matteo Rogero, we looked at 3 cities, one of them being Moscow, and Moscow was a very proactive climate city, but they were really able to reduce their local air pollution a lot, and then they were able to use this success to push themselves as a climate leading city. There are other studies for the US where this is used, maybe the advocacy potential of co-benefits is used to argue, hey, we need to do more on climate change. So we have different mechanisms here, but we also have many studies that show, hey, in these cities there would be substantial co-benefits, but they do not play out. They are not used in the debate, and they don't lead to more ambition. So again, here, also with co-benefits, although this might be plausible, we have a mixed picture. It's not that simple. Maybe we need to look in a more nuanced way how co-benefits or vulnerability or national action play out in various settings. And this is actually now the front line of research. Of course, there are more factors to consider, but really how to get to those mechanisms. And here I want to sketch one possible mechanism that might be interesting to study further here. It starts from I first found surprising finding. Many studies on urban climate action consider also how rich are those cities. Is this cities where people earn a lot of money? And although these previous factors like co-benefits and vulnerabilities has those mixed results, most studies show, hey, richer cities are doing more in terms of climate action. So first of all, why should this be? That's being rich has nothing to do primarily, at least directly, with climate change. But of course, you might say maybe being rich is a necessary condition for doing much. Maybe it's not sufficient, but it's necessary, right? If you have a larger cake, you can give more of the cake to your friends. But you don't have to. Maybe you keep it for yourself. So in this sense, it's not necessarily the case that you always get to more climate action. So, okay, let's unpack this a little bit further. So we can say, okay, we have a city with wealthy citizens, they are rich, yeah? And if they are taxed somehow, we can think maybe then if they are richer, it's more likely that the public administration has more funds. So this is just a sketch, right? And if the public administration has more funds, it might be more or less a one-to-one relation that they have more capacity to act. They can have more staff, they can make more advanced policies, and so on and so forth. So then, of course, if you can do more, you might also do more. So this is where it's not only you have a larger cake, but where you actually use it for more. Yeah. But it is always that simple. One thing we observe with relation to national or European or provincial policies that cities like to apply for support funds. So sometimes there are funding programs from, say, higher levels, right, where you can get additional money. But if you get such a fund, you have more funds. So that's the logic here. But for those funds, you need to apply your right proposals to get the money. And of course, we might see here, okay, if you have much capacity as a city, you're more capable of applying for those funds. So what we actually have here is a reinforcing effect, right? If you are rich, you get more and you can do more. But sometimes you don't have those other funds. And this is what some studies show, that then some cities try to go for these transnational municipal networks. So when you are a member of that, you exchange experience, best practices. So it might be that you can lower the costs of doing climate action, so then you can do more of it. But again, to become member of such a network, you need to maybe pay a membership fee, you need to travel there, you need to network. So if you have a have much staff in your administration, it's more easy to get such a network. Otherwise, it's more difficult. So we see also more, the larger cities, the richer cities are more likely to be members. So then again, we have another add-on effect where the richer get more. So that could be a reason why if you can do more, you also do more, might be enforced either through this channel or both. Things, of course, are more complicated, and here just two complications here that I think are important. That's about the motivation. So if you are already rich, if you have a lot of funds, why should you apply for those extra funds? Then the motivation for that might go down. And that also is plausible for networks, right? So why should I join a network if I can do it alone already? And there are some studies that show that these negative arrows exist. And of course, this we can now continue, right? There are more factors and about the motivation and the possibility to act. That's scientifically interesting to unpack. We can also use these sketches to think about policy conclusions, for example. So we have here the effect that large cities do more, but if they are too large, their motivation ceases. So maybe we should leverage the medium-rich cities, address them for climate policies, at least if they are working through these mechanisms. We have this enforcing climate funding effect. So, but if this is not available, we might try to introduce it. In the European Union, we have it for all countries, but can we have those funds for cities from other continents, from other countries? And of course, we can think about here with networks, if this is this enforcing mechanisms, maybe we need to design those networks that they are quite capable also of addressing particularly the poor cities. So now I'm running, I don't know, what is my time left? Okay. Okay, that's easy. So this is one sketch. We also try to study how these mechanisms or different factors go together in a more closed form. So this is one paper where we looked into a sample of more than 800 cities from Europe. We just looked whether they have a climate mitigation plan. So this is just about promises, not about implementing them. And we wanted to know in terms of these different variables and factors, which, when they go together, can explain that those cities have a plan. And here we were not able to find out a single variable again, and even not a set of 2 or 3 variables that add up to explain that. With the method we used here, we were able to identify 4 different patterns. So we could find that nearly all cities which are members of a network, this was this global compact of mayors in this case, have a climate plan. So that is really a simple pattern. Yeah, but there are many cities which are not covered by this network of cities setting. Some of them are instead covered by what we call green cities. So these are high capacity, here actually means rich, like we had before, wealthy cities that have a very good air quality. So that's why we call them green. So that we meant here, so they have little co-benefits from climate action because they have a good air quality anyway. So this could not be a motivator from them. And they are based in countries that are, in European comparison, environment in terms of climate change, more progressive. Yeah. So these are cities, yeah, where maybe national objectives and local capacity go together. This is also to some degree the case for the lighthouse cities. They are in progressive countries, they are rich, but these are specifically cities in countries that do not have an obligation from the national level to have a plan. So actually, that is the cities that are obliged to have a plan are based in, at least that was for 2016, the year that's the study. They are based in the United Kingdom, in France, in Slovakia, and Denmark, and Poland to some degree. The fourth pattern, that's completely different. We call them fundraising cities. They are based in countries where they have to anyway, but those countries are not so progressive in European comparison. We were quite puzzled about this constellation when we did some talks to people that know more about those cities. We found out that they're mostly in Slovakia and Poland. There were strong national programs to incentivize cities to participate, to have those plans, to be eligible to get specific European Union funds. Yeah, so okay, there are different reasons to do good things, I would say. Yeah. Okay, so these are the four types, and right there, some are similar, but they have the differences, and they're not simply additives. They're combined biological constellations. We did with a similar method a study on global scale with much less cities. Actually, there's a project, the Carbon Disclosure Project, run by several city networks where cities can voluntarily report their own carbon dioxide emissions according to a common standard. And we took all cities that reported in for at least 4 different years. So it's a low bar. This is all growing. It's not a well-established data set like the UN data sets for national statistics. Yeah. So all those cities that regularly reported are in the sample. You see them all here on the map. And here we wanted to know when they have more ambitious target in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, do they then also reduce more or not? So are targets empty promises? Are they converting into real actions? And here again, we found, not four here, we found 3 different configurations of factors that played out. The first one is the cities which have ambitious targets and they achieve a lot. But these are then those cities that are, compared to the sample, large in population. I think this was more than 1 million inhabitants, and are also then based in countries which are more progressive in terms of climate policy. So for them, the target played out. The target played out not so in the other 2. So number 2 were just the rich and large cities. Some of them had targets, some of them had no targets, but it was not so important. If you are rich and large, you'd use more emissions than the median of the whole set we have here. And that is the most puzzling one. We also found cities that achieved emission reduction, although they have no ambitious target, maybe a very low target or no target at all. But those cities without an ambitious target that achieved emission reductions were also small. So it's really, hey man, what is going on here? And then we looked, that's the advantage if you just have a small set of cases, right? We then read journalistic accounts and other reports of various cities. So these are sometimes cities that are more engaging in a more cautious diplomatic activity with their neighboring municipalities. So maybe there's a huge electricity provider who serves a whole region, and the city is just small compared to the other regions. So their targets would be of little use. They need to convince the neighboring municipalities maybe with more weak arguments. So that we can at least tell from looking at those cases when we want to give a lot more light to this logical quantitative argument. Now you can't cope anymore.
In countries, and then you said with strong climate policies, but on your slide it says without.
Yeah, thanks for correcting me. This is the right one. Yeah, so these we could look this up. These are the US cities partially. No? Yeah, thanks for the correction. So there are these that use the target to substitute what is missing on the national level, but if they are small, maybe they're not capable of doing that. So that is why it's plausible that they are also large here. Yeah, okay, I can continue with that, I think, but we need to go to the questions. So let me just wrap up. So I started with these objections. So here I would say climate governments have no limited action space. They can, municipal governments can do actions. They may sometimes follow national policies, but it's not necessary. We have a lot of exceptions here. City governments also act if they're not obliged to, and sometimes they are opposing that when they are obliged to. So it's here, these objections are not that simple. With the free rider problem, I think it's still mixed, right? We see cities that achieving more than national governments would aim for, or some do less. So here I put those question marks, since I think we need to understand more the mechanisms still that play out here. So that can be understood as maybe as a kind of negative ending here. We don't know enough about that, yeah. But I think what these studies so far at least show that there are already some insights that shows us this factor play out. Maybe not always, but we don't have zero knowledge, right? We have something to start from, and if we put the bits and pieces from these different papers and single studies together, we can already spot some mechanisms that can go deeper. And I think those patterns then really need to combine those factors. So the previous literature looked frequently on those factors separately or just adding them up in a linear estimation model. And of course, that's not that simple. So in this sense, scientifically more it's possible, but I think it's really important, not only for scientific reasons, but for policy reasons, to understand this even more. Municipalities need to play a role to deal with climate change. They can also indeed play a role. So let's find for ways to leverage that, in particular if global cooperation between nation states is getting weaker and weaker, which is really a serious concern. We need to look for any other kind of entry point. And I guess cities are not the only entry point here, but we should not miss this opportunity here. So thank you very much.
So are there any questions? Perhaps you can stand up and say. Okay. Yeah, so when you have a question,
for the online audience,
and you will state your name and ask your question.
Thank you. Very interesting. And then comes the and or the but. And this is very much covering structure, but not time. So it could be that you, within those categories, have those who keep their tracks in one of your packages, and they are always constantly that types. And then there are those who are latecomers, and they might wiggle a bit because they haven't decided really. Or it could be that some are twisting. It could be political understandings in the city, so it flips. So you have flip, so time. And I'm curious, I bet you also have an answer on time.
I have no definite answer. That is really a challenging thing at the moment. There are some studies and there are some insights about cities which join late a network or drop out. So there are not so many dropout studies yet, but there are. But we have a very bad record at the moment for longitudinal data on emissions and also on adaptation, which is even more difficult to measure. So here's the data. There's a great paper published 3 years ago. They measured carbon dioxide emissions, I think, from 100,000 cities around the world for 1 year. So first you are impressed, but then you can't tell something about a trend here. So this is where, in terms of larger data collection, there's still a way to go. But of course, when you go to case histories from single cities or a smaller set of cities, you can already learn a bit about that. So there are many early pioneering cities that have dropped out later or became, say, silent members now, and some of the latecomers are now more proactive. They can build on experience that it has done before. But we are far from having a good view on dynamic mechanisms here. That is very important to get better to.
Question here.
Gunnar from Koch. I don't think I need it.
You need for the recording.
Sorry? For your line, you're right. The people on the line. So you mentioned rich cities seem to be better equipped to handle it. Could it be as simple as rich citizens simply demand a better environment? If you're rich and you have a lot of your material needs, you move up the Maslow hierarchy and you start to care about air quality.
So that's a very good point. So in addition to wealth and vulnerability, another variable on the list is maybe it's progressive voters or citizens, right, that demand more climate action. And this might be correlated to size of a city or wealth of a city, right? That maybe larger cities have a more cosmopolitan citizenships that have friends in other cities on the world. That might be also a reason for that, yeah. But studies that control for both political preferences and wealth or size do not find usually a simple one-to-one relation between those. There's some studies that compare rural with urban areas, and it gets more interesting because then you have wealth and political position being more aligned. Yeah, but it depends on what kind of city you look at. What do we have? We have another study that is not published yet, where we analyze local elections in Germany and in how far local communities expand photovoltaic investment. And there we find that when the Green Party in local elections get more votes, there will be less renewable expansion. So that is not what we want to hear, and that's a surprise, and that's not published. We are still thinking about the mechanisms to get through that, and it might be through public perception mediated by media, but that again shows it's not that simple. Yeah. But it's very important to get deeper into these political preferences and also cultural cultural convictions or norms that are shared by urban people around the world.
I have a question here.
Caroline Scheel from the Bayer Institute. Thanks so much, Klaus, for a great talk. I would actually like to build on this question around wealth, but I was more curious about wealth from industries or like big corporate actors that are close to cities. And yeah, if you can tell us a bit more about that, how that plays a role.
Yeah, there are some studies that measure wealth, and then you have the share of value added maybe by the service sector or by fossil fuel sectors. There are actually not so much studies on that I would like to see. Some of them indeed show what you can expect, right? Confirm the intuition here. But some show a less straightforward thing. And I think that might be partially due to where those firms are based. So I think employment in the mining industry might be a very important thing, but this is more rural. And this research is much focused on larger cities. So that's also bias in the work so far, that larger cities are more studied than the medium and small size ones. Yeah. And if the headquarters of the mining firm are, I don't know, in Zurich, yeah, maybe people don't know that they are based there, right? So that is why I think this is more difficult to. It might be interesting to. We had but it was just a master's thesis. She studied the land use share for industry in a city. So we have cities where you have many and low industrial areas. That was for 2 European countries. I don't remember, but there was a slight positive effect in the sense that a more green industry might lead to more likelihood of having a climate action. But we need to be cautious here still. Yeah.
There was a question in the back here, the lady there.
My question was, or in comment. Oh, sure. My name's Mandy. I'm a student at Stockholm University and also work on international environmental law. My question / comment was kind of just addressed now, and more about the wealth thing. was curious about the dynamics of corporations and the wealth and how they influence the city policy, because it's not that people of low income don't want to have clean air. It's just they don't have power, and oftentimes the dirty industries are placed within their neighborhoods. So I think it's a universal human thing that we all want to have clean air and clean water. And yeah, so it's not that wealthier people want it more. They just have more power to address it. But yeah, you already answered about the corporate lobbying with the governments and the city policy. So
that's part of it. What we actually want to understand also is more the issue whether it's a wealthy city or it's a wealthy government. So depending on the countries, there are huge differences, right, in how far, say, the local budget depends on a certain industry or not. So that could be also interesting to put more light on that. But it's really difficult to get data on public budgets that is comparable across different countries because the taxation systems are so different. Yeah.
Other question? Or do we have some question online, perhaps? No? We have a question there.
So this is Gunnar von Gotch again. And maybe building on your first question, the time question, because do you find cities to be more stable than national governments? So that they are either, conservative or progressive, but they stay that way more straight than a government, let's say the US, for example, or Germany for that, or EU, they wiggle a lot, but perhaps cities go straighter.
So I would say to some degree we have indication for that. Of course, it's still you can't sustain maybe a totally detrimental national government forever, right? You also, if you're depending on their funds, with this one channel I pitched, then maybe it's more critical. An important factor is whether it's a country which has a federal constitution that grants more rights to those cities than in other countries. So that is maybe, say, where countries like Germany or the US might have an advantage. But we also have soft mechanisms like this city of Moscow, right? They had a very progressive mayor being elected, I think that was 2012 or so. And this was accepted by the national government that this was a progressive mayor because it's just a mayor and not the president, it's just a city. Yeah, and I think that also explained partially why Chinese cities are accepted to be active in city networks. Yeah, so in the sense there are also soft ways to sustain that, and that partially I would say it depends also on the framing, right? Is it a international collaboration to deal with climate change? Or maybe it's just an exchange of experience to deal with local, to make local transport more efficient, right? And then you can reframe it, and you can maybe sustain stability, right? But there's a good debate in how far this mostly depends then on local individuals, which are very entrepreneurial and very good negotiators and can sustain that. And what is then happening if such a person just retires, say, let's keep it simple. Yeah, don't speak about other cases. And then the question is, how far does such entrepreneurial individuals can inject some stability in the whole process. And there are some studies that links us to these networks, right? Maybe you're a very proactive city that ignores networks. You see your term comes to an end. So let's get part of a network and make commitments so to bind possibly the hands of a subsequent local government with more or less success, right? Yeah.
So I have a question. When you talk about these city commitments, it's really like cleaning the air in the city. What about the footprint that the cities have on other parts of the land? Because there is lots of, when you have people in cities, you need building materials, you need food, and that comes from other places. Do you have any assessments of how green they are in that respect? And
so that is partially in the accounting, right, of these in emissions. I think there are standards now which can be, it's more difficult, I would say, if it goes for food or local air pollution. But there's now a standard that actually comes from measuring industry emissions that we distinguish between scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So scope 1 emissions are those that are caused on the area of the city. So this can be measured already with, did I push the wrong button here? That can be measured with satellite data now quite well. While with scope 2, you also account for the emissions from energy imports to the city, and this is usually much more. And with scope 3, you measure all other imports and exports also from ordinary goods and services. And I would say for cities, the scope 3 data, it's still work in progress. Yeah. So there are really limits to that. Yeah.
I can imagine. And it's really hard to not double count some things and omit some things. And yeah, I see that.
Yeah, I've read somewhere, don't ask me to find it, I think it was in Economist, but they actually said that a city is a very efficient way of living from a climate perspective, that you actually have less emissions from people living in cities than elsewhere. So that should really foster more investigations in how to make a city more greener, because it has a huge impact. I don't know if is that true or
Yeah, that goes into land use policy. So in particular, I think that's clear for housing emissions. So for industrial emissions, I would say it's not that simple. But I know there's an argument for housing emissions. So if you have more condensed living, right? If you have many people living in one huge house, you have less surface compared to the volume. That's a simple thing behind it, right? You need less energy to get the same temperature heating. So in this sense, living in a more compact way is better. There are some countervailing effects when you want to have good airflows through the city. So if you would just live in huge buildings, then you have much less air circulation. So you need to have some green spaces in between, and then the trade-offs get more complicated. But still, a city performs better than a rural area. So if you would all live scattered around, equally distributed, housing emissions would be much larger. And this is also a co-benefit argument. Yeah, even if you want to have a centrally planned modern city, say a smart city in a huge area in India or China, right? You can ask what is the best way to have low heating costs to give a place to many people.
More questions? No? Well, then I think this seminar goes to an end. Thank you again, Klaus, for this very interesting presentation.